open-mindedness towards privacy, data protection. There has been a lot more open-mindedness with Congress to working with technology entrepreneurs. And for me, that has been an incredible opportunity to actually work with the government, where I felt like the past 4 years, everything has become very politicized. It was a huge struggle for entrepreneurs to actually understand what type of laws or regulations they may or may not be working with. But especially when we're talking about digital identity, when we're talking about using data for wellness, there's a lot of huge opportunities with this administration in the US because, for instance, the Biden administration made an appointment of Professor Jerry Gensler to be the head of the SEC, who was a blockchain technology professor at MIT. That's an incredible step up from the last round of SEC appointments, which were mostly people who had not spent their life's work in cutting edge technology. So their understanding of how a lot of this tech worked and how to regulate it was very surface level and incredibly shallow, in my opinion. But now we actually have some of the world's top experts that are working on regulation where they used to come from, either a developer or an education background. And so I think that's incredibly important for other members of the government to understand why these cutting edge technologies are so important, and also to have more common sense regulation where we should expect to actually have rules that entrepreneurs can work with.
So would you say that it takes the downfall of a regime such as Mr. Trump's to open up to new possibilities? Because Mr. Trump has also had some very interesting selections of staff, if I may say so, especially in the technological sector. So, we're facing a difficult period in Europe right now. And since this talk is about well-being and data in Europe and beyond, and you're calling in from Texas, let's talk about the US first and then potentially get some examples for the European Union.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think in general, the willingness of the United States to now start to consider some of the regulatory work that has already been a part of the EU's supranational legislative infrastructure for the past few years is so amazing. I mean, we basically have been fighting amongst a few different states in the US to pass privacy laws and data protection laws that have been now in the EU for over 3 years. So it's really shown that through the last administration, we were not able to catch up to Europe. And so Americans are still far behind in our protections. We're far behind on being able to develop some of these solutions, not just in the legislative and regulatory front, but in terms of actually developing technologies that are going to help people on a day-to-day basis. Because the European infrastructure says that you have ownership over your data, that you have rights to transparency, that you have the ability to ask and receive copies of your data from both public and private sector organizations, that you can get copies of that you can have the right to delete data that is something you don't want out there, that you actually have these types of mechanisms and these rights. We're in the US, I think we still have a little while to go for what we're fighting for. And I think one of the most important things when we're talking about, data and wellness is for individuals to have access to their own data. One of the most tragic things about the lack of privacy or the lack of data protection, in my opinion, is not just that perhaps millions of databases around the world to have access to our data, but it's that we don't have access to our data. If I were to have an entire database of all of my live data, all of my historic data, and I could use a system to learn more about myself in order to improve my own life, that's really what the goal should be. But I would probably have to spend quite a lot of time and money trying to purchase and license data sets about myself that I can't easily access from all of these data vendors, in Europe, in the US, around the world. And I still would not have a good understanding of all of the data that I've produced. So I think it's incredibly important for not just the data protection and privacy movement, but for the future of using technology for our own personal benefit, for our own wellness, that we would have access to that data and be able to start to use systems that could improve our own lives. Everything from helping us organize our time better to helping us make better choices about, how we sleep, how we eat, how we interact with other people. All of these things would be greatly beneficial to our lives, but right now don't really exist because we don't have any rights outside of Europe to the data that we're producing.
So you were the CEO of a very big company called Cambridge Analytica, and you were profiling people in order for them to actually engage in certain activities as well. And if you don't mind, could you touch on your work a little bit? And you and I, we've been friends for a while. And I know that you care a lot about data because after you came out as a whistleblower of Cambridge Analytica, you also started the Open Data Foundation in order to improve people's rights in data. So could you talk a little bit about the shift away from your work towards a more just relationship to data? And how do you think an individual should handle their data today? That's linked to the question that I just asked.
Absolutely. So when I first decided to get further into data science and to advance predictive analytics, some of the most interesting projects that I was a part of, and this is when I first joined Cambridge Analytica before I was even a director, I was shown the opportunity to, for instance, be able to get access to large data sets that belong to a government of a country so that we could figure out how to, build local hospitals so that they actually had the specialties that were needed by the people in those areas. How could we run communications campaigns to actually get people to go and use those medical facilities? How could we run a campaign that would get more young people to practice safe sex and use condoms, for instance? And all of these were data-driven projects that had to do with having large-scale access to both personal information of individuals, but also a lot of government research, a lot of surveys focused.
So you're saying you were using data for well-being also at Cambridge Analytica in many cases?
In the beginning, when I first got there, those were the only projects I worked on. I joined a group called SCL Social, which stood for just all of the social projects that the company was doing. So we were working for ministries of health. We were working for different government departments, United Nations departments. And in general, these campaigns are called behavior change campaigns. Mm-hmm. And they're meant to be able to spot different types of behavioral patterns in people and be able to actually use that information.
Now, how do you do that? How do you spot these different parts?
So that's mostly the work on the data scientist part, which is to be able to see, for instance, like what types of messaging resonates with people? What types of messages do people engage with? What questions are people normally answering, or what things are they engaging with, where you can tell that if you were to
evaluate the answers, like because for example, I can be bitchy and say no thank you and really mean something, I don't know, completely different. Sometimes an individual expresses themselves differently from actually what they feel. So that's
You're precisely right. And that's the reason why a lot of the research that we were doing at the time had to do with people being on camera, doing in-depth focus group work, because you could tell if someone was actually saying one thing and meaning something else because you could read their body language. So we had a lot of social, behavioral, and clinical psychologists that work with the researchers, and they would gather the data and work with the data scientists in order to spot those patterns. But then it was really psychologists that were interpreting those patterns. And so a lot of this work is very common in government work, very common in international organizations like the United Nations implementation, especially in their development programs. And although there's so much good that can come from that, I also saw that as something that was pretty top down. It's really the government or a company or whoever is actually creating these communications, which at the time, was Cambridge Analytica and our partners, and they're telling the population, what they should be doing and convincing people to change their behavior because there is some, more preferred behavior. If you, for instance, were using, witch doctors and your government just built a nice new hospital that you and your family could easily get to, how do you get someone to actually use the modern hospital and take their kids to the doctor as opposed to going to a local witch doctor, which might have been a more traditional choice? And so these are the types of programs where, yes, that's very helpful, but I, as a individual, I'm interested in individuals having access to that data. And I think a lot of well-being, I think a lot of issues around our own health and the choices that we make every single day are going to be informed by us as individuals having access to some of that information, as opposed to a top-down system where we're being influenced to change our behavior by an organization that has decided our behavior needs to be changed. And so my evolution in thinking while I was at this company was, okay, these tools are incredible and incredibly powerful, but I don't like the idea that everyone has access to my data easily besides me. Why do all of these companies and governments have access to information that could change my behavior, where I don't get to see that information, and I myself could probably benefit greatly from having access to that? So when I transitioned out of that company and became a whistleblower and started working with more ethical technologists, as well as regulators and a lot of educators, learning about how people could have more direct access to their own information and how you could use it for yourself and for your own impact. That really decidedly became kind of my obsession, which is, how do we legally and how do we technologically get access to all of our data and start to be able to use that to benefit ourselves and our families and our communities, of course. But, starting at a personal level, starting at the level of your own digital identity and the information that you produce every single day, how do we start to get access to that? And that then opens up a whole world of opportunity of what we could do with it.
Mm. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, since we're invited here by the European Commission at the European Social Economic Summit. I always say innovation. For me, the economy and innovation hopefully tend to go hand in hand. But the cloud nation, as you know, is this idea of people being able to stick together beyond borders. And so we have governments that separate between a parent and a child, or an adult and a child, or a woman and a man. And we see many people breaking through these boundaries. And the idea of the cloud nation is linked to this idea of the cloud law that we're discussing very much in the European Commission right now, which is to allow every person to have their own perception and to own that own perception, because according to Albert Einstein, time and space are relative, depending on the observer. And so this is something that obviously is very difficult to be tracked, technologically speaking, but it does form a philosophical shift away from government, obviously, as well. And so my question would be, because we're looking very much at data access points. So we have another person coming in 15 minutes who's a scientist, very much focused on cryptography and the setup of the cloud law, essentially. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about data access points and basically ways to fuel your data into one station that you own. So my question to you would be, what can a user do right now in order to own their data? And do you believe in this global idea of a community that can promote well-being beyond borders even? Is that something?
I completely agree with you. I think being able to have access to your data at all times, where it's not connected to your government giving you that right, where it's you as an individual being able to take advantage of the most cutting edge technologies of cryptography, of blockchain technology, in order to constantly have access to your data and to have your data be able to be safely and anonymously and consensually linked back to you, is really going to vastly improve our ability to make decisions in our own life and to enhance our own well-being or anything else in our lives that we feel like needs to be improved. And the best way to really go about this is for individuals to have what are called digital identities. More often in the blockchain community, you'll hear these referred to as DIDs, so decentralized IDs. And that type of technology means that all of your most personal information, so your name, your address, your email, your social security number, all of these important details that most people should never have access to, all of that stays private. Mm-hmm. So your personally identifiable information, or as what some people in data science call it, your PII, that is information that is always kept private. And all of the rest of the data that you produce can be anonymously linked back to you. So I could log into an application, for instance, with my decentralized ID, and the application I'm logging into, which currently, without using these technologies, would get access to a lot of my personal information. Instead, I would log in with my decentralized ID, and all of my most private information would be anonymous, but I'd be able to verify who I was. So then I could get access to, all of my location data, all of the people I've talked to that day, all the things I've searched for, whatever my behavioral patterns have happened to be.
And do you think that the human brain is smart enough to be able to comprehend all of that? Mm-hmm. And what happens if we match that data with other data? So if we create such a machine where you have all of the information of people, what they purchase, what they eat, how much they sleep, and then let's say you have a mega parliament that's connected through different data points, is that not the most dangerous weapon on Earth? And can that be used for any good, is the question. Is that not to be used for something negative?
Right. And so the way that I normally think about these more ethical and moral questions is, what is the best that we could do with these technologies, but also what's the worst that could happen with these technologies? And what we need to do is always make sure that we legislate and regulate, but also build technology to weed out bad actors. So when we're designing these things, when we're making sure that people have access to these types of technologies, we need to make sure that they're built in a way where if you were going to try to abuse the system, that would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. That's one of the reasons why I think that certain new forms of encryption that are, I suppose, just starting to come out, like quantum resistant encryptions, for instance, and blockchain technologies where we are
quantum
really
resistance encryption. Could you go into that? What
Absolutely.
is that?
So there are some new forms of encryption that are coming out that are more, I suppose, secure for once quantum computing starts to become more of a popular thing. So instead of just basing your cryptography on, for instance, the infinite factorization of prime numbers, you also have more unpredictable variables in that in those encryptions. For instance, you could be using like light, sound, music that kind of weaves into some of your equations that are more randomized, so that it would be impossible for even a quantum computer to break that type of encryption. Because when we're talking about privacy, when we're talking about keeping ourselves safe from the abuse of some of these tools, it really is about the technology, less about the law. Because the law will never protect you from abuse of technology, really. It's making sure that the technology is resistant to hackers, to bad actors. And so if we are able to keep our most personal information safe and make sure the rest of the data that we're creating is anonymized, then we have a real opportunity for people to be safe from the bad actors and therefore be free to use this information for their own good. And I want to touch on the first question that you asked, which was, is the human mind really able to take advantage of all of this information? And, you're right to point that out, because really, I don't think so. I think we need to have some of these advanced technology tools that are modeling this data for us, that are giving us some of the intelligence out of this data, because it's way too difficult with the human eye, us to be able to spot these behavioral patterns. It's really running tons of modeling and algorithms where I'm, for instance, able to tell, I eat too late at night and therefore I can't sleep very well when I try to go to sleep. So if I were to eat, an hour or two earlier, I would actually be able to have another sleep cycle at night, and I would be much more productive during the day. That's just, a surface level example of the types of insights that you could have if I had access to all of my biofeedback data and all of my behaviors and my timing on what I'm doing. And and that's the type of thing where I think we'll really see like revolutionary changes in personal well-being and therefore in societal well-being once we can start to get access to all of this high-level granular information and, find different ways to employ it in our own lives.
So this is a preparatory session right now for an ongoing series that we have. I haven't asked you yet to participate, but I'll kind of force you to, because essentially we have been in contact with 500 schools around the world to also introduce psychonomic profiling in the schools as modules. And so what will happen is that people will log online and find out how they can use their data, who wants to monetize their data, and how actually an opinion comes to its creation. And so I think that well-being through data is also something that's really important in order to connect the online person and the offline person, right? This also goes out to the audience. Like, what kind of things would you like to have answered here? Because we are preparing these courses. We are going to approach these 500 schools globally. And it is going to be important to actually impact also the teachers, right? So at the moment, we're not only looking at how to communicate to the students what well-being is and how they can achieve well-being also online, but people are so different, and the data of people is so different, for a mom who's at home, she maybe is further away from the topic of data and data intelligence than someone who's a businessman, but they're both impacted by it, right? So how do we actually bring it to the households? And do you think that should be something that people should be educated about? I hope so. And I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think the more that you can learn about yourself, especially your learning style, and starting to notice behavioral patterns about yourself, the more you can improve, the more you can actually set goals and work towards them. So I think starting to have this level of understanding about yourself when you're really young could be incredibly helpful in helping develop better daily habits, better learning practices, and therefore a healthier life, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Some of the education programs that I've been working with that help kids understand how to better use technology, for example, they very much concentrate on physical health, and mental and emotional health when you are using technology, and make sure that you're not just going to be safe or protected when you're online, but that you can also use technology tools to be a more successful person. So on the physical side, making sure that you don't have device addictions and that you understand how to manage your own screen time. On the mental and emotional side, making sure that you know how to protect yourself from cyberbullying, but also how to not be a cyberbully. How do you use emotional intelligence?
And what do you do with fake accounts? Like, do you anticipate a lot of fake supportive services coming to the front lines? Because on Telegram, for example, there's a lot of nasty groups where everyone pretends to be nice and everything is about bullying. And so people are really fucked up sometimes. So how do we prevent that from happening?
So this is actually one of my favorite questions, because the way I see it is we have created a monster, so to say, by having a no man's land on social media. And what I mean by that is that there is no legal liability for your behavior because of the way that laws are written, both in Europe and in the US and elsewhere. Social media platforms don't have legal liability for what users publish. But users don't have liability either because they are not identity checked in order to have an account. So that means usually it's estimated like at least 50 or 60% of the accounts on Facebook and Twitter are fake. Which means that it's really easy for fake news and disinformation to go viral, for people to be cyberbullied and to be attacked by bots or troll farms. And really, because of this legal no man's land where the platform isn't responsible and individuals can't be held responsible, we are left with quite a nasty landscape, as you rightly pointed out. It really is a landscape that can easily become dangerous. And so one of the things that I have put forward as a policy proposal, it's something that I believe that the European Union is probably going to take more seriously, but the US is also looking at it too, which is let's develop a system of liability. And so if the liability is going to be on the companies, we need to have in the US, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act changed. In Europe, there's already some decent laws that are being written around it to hold these companies responsible. But the other choice is to make users responsible, but have us be identity checked. So in order to get an account on one of these platforms, I would have to be a real person. And I think that's
And
really
how do you think these kinds of things could be changed with the GDPR? Because we just got a question from the audience about GDPR and how it could be undone. I know a couple of fans of the GDPR. I think Carsten Stecker, who just joined us as an expert in data, he's a partner of ours in spherity.com. And yeah, basically GDPR is a very much discussed topic. Brittany, if I could have your opinion on that.
Absolutely. So, we're at around the 3-year anniversary of GDPR, and I still find myself today when I'm helping write new data protection laws where I'm more often taking elements out of GDPR to use to write new laws, because so many years of thought was put into GDPR that there are really incredible parts of it that are very useful. One of the elements that I find that I use most often is purpose limitation. So thinking about when we're collecting data for a certain purpose, that companies and organizations and governments would not then be able to use that data for something else. So I'll give you a more granular example, which is that at the beginning of last year, at the beginning of the coronavirus shutdown, I got together with a group of people and wrote the first Coronavirus Contact Tracing Data Protection Act. And that law was meant to say that if companies and governments are collecting data for public health purposes, then they could not use that data, for instance, to track and trace peaceful protesters, because this was also around the rise of the BLM movement. And a lot of law enforcement officials in places around the world were using contact tracing data to figure out who was protesting. And that was a big threat to the rights of people to peacefully assemble, right? And so having those types of concepts in GDPR means that this particular set of regulation really has set the forefront of what the concepts in data protection need to be, but we still have a bit of issues on enforceability. So I don't know if I need to get into the whole, the amount of data complaints versus the ability of the ICOs to respond. But I do think that a lot of the fundamentals of GDPR we're always going to use, and they've been very well thought out and very well written. But the enforceability of some of that, we're still in the infancy of trying to figure that out when technology moves faster than legislation. But we'll get there.
Okay. I hope we will. Also in different regions of the world. Now, Carsten Stöcker, I don't know why it says Henning Jakob over your screen. Maybe you want to introduce yourself briefly, and then we have a couple of slides prepared about data and well-being, and then we'll get into that. And in the beginning, it would be great to also ask Brittany some questions, since we're talking about the syllabus that we're going to be introducing in these 500 schools about how to evaluate and track your data, and who's interested in actually purchasing from a person, and what you can do with it and how to secure it. So I'm just gonna let you introduce yourself, and then hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion about the syllabus from there. And Brittany, I know that you have to leave at some point. That's perfectly fine. It's 8 a.m., 9 a.m. now in Texas, right? But if you could stay with us for a little while, and also please ask questions together with the audience about what you're about to hear, because this is the first time that we're actually presenting it. And anyone who has questions, please. Oh, I don't think we can hear Carsten.
Yeah, now it's
better?
We can
hear you. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. A pleasure being here together with you, Paula and Brittany. My name is Carsten Stöcker. I'm a physicist, and I work for Spherity. And Spherity is kind of inspired by the World Economic Forum, because they have a definition of the fourth industrial revolution. And basically, the fourth industrial revolution is fusion of technologies. and bridging the physical sphere with objects and machines and the biological spheres with humans, organizations, and living species, with the digital sphere of digital objects, agents, and digital identity. And if everything is kind of connected with everything else, that's basically what bridging the spheres is about, then we need different trust frameworks and infrastructures. And what Gartner is talking about agile defined or dynamically defined agile value chains, basically means that any kind of couple of value chain actors in the modern IoT, 5G, connectivity-driven world could potentially interact with each other. And because today we have more kind of linear supply chains, supplier and customer, and in the new kind of fully connected digital worlds, any actor in Mexico, China, Germany could connect in a physical value chain, also in digital value chain transaction. And this means we need different trust frameworks. And we have to have the ability to establish trust. And trust comes with data. And then we have a little bit of a dilemma, because when we share a lot of data or put it on platforms, and there's a lot surveillance, opportunity for surveillance and data privacy issues. That's what we would like to avoid. And at Sverity, so we are working on identity solutions, trust solutions, and modern cryptography to make sure that we can establish trust in a privacy-preserving way. Yeah.
Wonderful. And can you open the presentation that we have prepared, or is it possible, or can only I do that?
I think I can share.
Okay, fantastic.
Let me see. It's probably now being shared, isn't it?
It is being shared, yeah. I don't know if I can hide us.
Yeah. And that's basically this bridging the spheres in terms of force and dust solution. That's basically also kind of the theme of our presentation, because we talk about social innovation with digital identity in the cyber-physical world. Yeah? Because when every physical object, physical human being gets a digital agent, digital identity, so that's what we basically call cyber-physical world. And this goes with a lot of opportunities for exploitation. Yeah. You probably have heard about so when the Siemens equipment was attacked in Iran in the nuclear power plants, yeah, this was also a cyber-physical vulnerability. And it's not only about privacy and our data, it's also about really the impact of health and safety if kind of hackers get in the systems and can start manipulating them. So identity has a lot to do with cyber-physical security and safety and health.
Have we historically ever had something like that, where hackers were able to access something? I mean, now we had the airplane capture from Belarus in Greece, right? Would you consider that a threat to well-being through data, that states can actually manipulate an airplane? Is that too far reached? I'm just thinking about.
No, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case. I think in this Iranian nuclear power plant, I forgot the name of the attack. Yeah, I think it's pretty prominent in the news, because it was one of the first cyber-physical attacks by the intelligence agencies, the CIA and co., where they basically developed a virus that was attacking nuclear power or equipment of a nuclear power plant in Iran. And this was a very sophisticated attack. And I think so there are a couple of more attacks. So when Teslas are getting hacked or other cars and access gateways, there's a lot of these attack vectors. And for example, in the energy sector, what's very interesting, the energy sector has separated their power grids from the telecommunication grids. But now with a smart grid, there's a conversion. So basically telecommunication equipment is kind of connected, interlinked with physical power grids. And that's again another cyber-physical attack vector. Yeah. And I think in US, this was in recent days when the gas or oil pipeline, I think it was an oil pipeline, that was attacked by cyber-physical threat. I think these are exactly the examples where the physical and the digital world are interacting with each other. This is a big impact on our health and safety.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we're focusing
also
on the measurement.
pacemakers. There's also
Let's not only focus on the we're looking a lot at the risks at the moment. But let's talk about ways to actually also secure our well-being and make money even with our well-being and with the good usage of our data, because there's very interesting tools for that as well. So what do you have in store for that in the presentation?
Yeah, basically, I think, so we said that everything is connected with everything else. That's what Leonardo da Vinci also said. And he said, develop a complete mind, study the art of science, and study the science of art. And there's a lot of duality. And I think at Leonardo's times, 400 years ago, it was duality of art and science. And these days, you have duality of digital and physical world. And we're just exploring the entire impact and enlightenment of this duality. And as you mentioned, risks, opportunities. But I also kind of, let's say, using this quote from Leonardo, because he was already talking about everything connects with everything else. And now with the digital world, literally everything connects with everything else. And that's a bit of a framing. And as mentioned, I think there was a couple of industrialization steps, second, third, and fourth industrial revolution. And when the third industrial revolution was a lot of automation and computers, more working in silos, a little bit connected among a couple of APIs. So in the Industry 4.0, it's basically cyber physical systems blended with machine learning, and there's much more digital identity in the store. And if we look a little bit on the if we look a little bit on the numbers, let me quickly go to the numbers and then we go back. So we had at the beginning of the internet a couple of 100 million domains. And then we now have 4 to 5 billion or 6 billion people on the internet. But now with all the machines, the IoT devices, that has a direct impact on our life. There's a lot more activity and interactions going on. And then when a lot of software agents are also coming into play, and agents, we're all aware of Amazon Alexa, it's a software agent, a personal agent, or health analytics, so where I share my wearable data, my smartwatch, my Apple Watch data. So with machine learning algorithms, or when I ask a mobility agent to optimize a route to go from home to work, or do an asset optimization, I share my assets. I participate in the sharing economy, and this is all being kind of supported by software. And so we see an inflation of further transactions on the internet and further entities, in this case software agents. And that's something where we need to prepare ourselves.
So what about Alexa, and what about the data that they own? Do they have any kind of responsibility to use that for the well-being of the user? Do they, according to GDPR, how can that be improved even? Because it's so powerful to be such a big data agent, as you say, and to collect so much information. And how can that be used for the benefit of the people? What can we do also legally to secure that in the future?
Yeah, no, I think right now it's I would say a naive approach, because when you use Amazon Alexa, you give your consent, yeah. But let's say an ordinary citizen or person doesn't have a clue. If I give a consent to Alexa to listen to me, to use my data, what happens in the background? I think what people can also do, they can basically ask Amazon to disclose all the recordings of Amazon Alexa, and then a lot of people are overwhelmed by the amount of data and conversations that have been captured, and by the deep insights. So Amazon basically established by collecting all the data. And I say it's a bit of a naive approach, because I think the ordinary human, they would like to have a user experience and convenience, yeah. They don't really think about the data privacy or cyber physical attack vectors, because when I exploit Amazon Alexa, I exactly know what's going on inside the home, when people are at home, what they do at home. That's pretty much a big kind of, let's say, insights into individuals, people's privacy. And right now it's naive, because people give a consent, and then they don't even care what's happening.
But they also don't have a choice, right? Like also if you buy a new computer at Apple, it says agree here or don't use the computer. Like
it's a balance of power with the big digital companies, because there's not much choice. If you would like to have a user experience and connect with other people, you sign up for Facebook, you use the Amazon Alexa tools, and you do your Google search, and every of these tools is mass surveillance tools. Yeah, and I think you probably mentioned that Brittany with Cambridge Analytica, all these tools can be used. This very, let's say, even kind of evil micro-targeting to influence people, to influence people's political decisions, behaviors, and this has even an impact on health when people kind of, let's say, change their habits and change their behavior to watch TV instead of doing sports. I think this has a very big impact. Yeah? And right now, we are basically a passive consumer of all these digital tools, but we're not really empowered neither from a bit from education. So in Germany, people in the, let's say, in the lower classes, young students, pupils, they get a little bit of, let's say, the threats of the digital economy, but in the end, when they go home, they don't care because then they do the gaming and use the social media. I think people get careless, yeah, and that's a very, very big threat as well.
So
that's one of the things Sorry, I was just gonna jump in and ask a question specifically because I find that if you're working from a top-down angle, so you've collected data on all of these people, you usually will have access to plenty of tools that help you analyze this data and gain a lot of intelligence out of it. And so whether you're running a behavior change campaign or you're doing something that is more helpful and impactful to the individual, it's definitely something that these are tools that individuals are not given. So I like how you mentioned earlier that you said, even if we were to request all of this data from Amazon, for instance, all of the data from the Alexa in our house, the amount of this data is so overwhelming that it would be difficult for us to perhaps find the behavioral patterns and the insights in this data that would actually help us improve our own lives. So have you seen any tools that are currently being used that are more for the individual to start to understand all of the data that they produce?
I mean, maybe we can touch right into the schedule there, because that's exactly what we're looking at, what we're producing. And Andreas Waller, also in the audience, had a similar question as to how you can actually gain control of your data and get the most out of it.
Yeah, a lot of questions. I think I have not seen many of these tools, yeah. But what I would like to share, because I think it's so super powerful, you basically have all heard about the I must share it. Yeah, Cyberpunk.
In the Brave browser, no?
Huh?
The Brave browser.
That's my Edge browser. I think this is very old. Yeah, that's the Cyberpunk Manifesto by Eric Hughes, and this dates back from 1993, when basically the internet was being invented. And what I like about this manifesto, because it's so powerful, it's basically saying privacy is necessary for an open society in an electronic age. Privacy is secrecy. And basically then he's talking about that we require anonymous transaction systems, yeah? And what we have built so far on the internet is the exact opposite of the Cyberpunk Manifesto. And why is it so powerful? Because Bitcoin was inspired by this Cyberpunk Manifesto, and a lot of stuff around this decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity movement. So where I, as a human, as an individual, have full control about my data. It's not kind of stored with Google, with the government, with Facebook, with Amazon, with Bosch, with Siemens, with BMW. It's basically stored under my control, and I have the most actual data set and not outdated data with Schufa or with with Equifax in US. All this data is completely outdated. It's incomplete. It gives a wrong kind of perception about myself. In the self-sovereign identity movement, I have full control about my data, and I decide which data I share, and I'm completely empowered with consent agreements, with kind of, let's say, access control tools to my data against all these digital companies. And especially, there's also a macroeconomic benefit, because when you think about all these platforms, then people who are on the platform, they can transact, exchange data, establish trust, but people on different platforms can't do it. And that's again the decentralized identities, self-sovereign identities, cyberpunk manifesto ideas that basically with cryptography I can empower people who have never met before, who are not on Facebook, not on Twitter, not in the German government, nowhere. Basically, they can establish trust among each other, and that's very powerful. And these are the tools. And basically, I would say this is just a foundation that's now being kind of laid with this technologies. And we see a lot of adoption here. We see the World Wide Web Consortium kind of driving very hard on getting the standards in place. So there's huge ecosystems getting the standards in place, the identity in place, the privacy in place for COVID vaccination credentials, for example. So that's, I think that's, let's say, the groundwork, the nuts and bolts for more privacy preserving identity. But Brittany, when you mention all the other tools, the intelligent agents, the machine learning on top of it, under my control, that's just not existing. Yeah.
I mean, there is something that so the way that we want to go about the course is actually that we show people how to, first of all, we register your data in a cryptographic system, basically that's between the offline and the online world, so as to create a community of people who get prepared for understanding their data online in order to be able to then have access to this World Datanomic Forum, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's linked to a thing that's called a KYC process. That's a know your customer process that people are probably familiar with when it comes to banks. And so because it's offline KYC and not online, it forms the basis of connection between the online and the offline world, of course. And then we are thinking right now if it makes sense to have offline courses where people essentially come together in different parts of the world, or we do it online in these 500 schools that we have access to, where it is essentially about understanding how to secure your data in these digital agents. And there we have the problem right now that these agents that collect the information are privatized at the moment. So, you know, Alexa from Amazon is one, but there is no real I mean, audience, please also get in touch or write something if you find this not accurate what I'm saying, but there is not a real agent that is trustworthy in a way where the agent is not linked to personal interests of any kind. But of course, that would be the preferred scenario. And so we're waiting right now for the movement to create something like that so that people can also have their data organized in a way that promotes well-being. And then it will be around taking decisions in a completely new way, right? So essentially, if I then am able to transport my data into, I have here a Coca-Cola bottle, and if I transport basically everything that I do and the things that I think into something else, then of course this will open up new questions. But the thing is also that we as individuals will be able to understand ourselves in a much better way, right? If we essentially are able to collect this information. And because it's important to understand how this works, we're offering this course. And then right now, Carsten, as you know, we've built this World Datanomic Forum that works a little bit like Reddit, where no question is too stupid to be asked. And so essentially, any question can be posed into there so that we can find a solution in order to gamify also the idea of a parliament. And so that we can star questions as being really really important or not so important. And yes, there will be difficult questions or funny questions that are being asked. Of course, sexual harassment and racism are not welcome. But yeah, we're looking at these different modules, and we hope to increase well-being that way, right? Because we understand that there's tools that people use or can use also as the Brave browser, where you have the basic attention token. So at the moment, a lot of people use Google but we aim to also introduce the basic attention token and the Brave browser in those modules, in the relative psychonomic courses. And what is the Brave browser? The Brave browser is a browser that essentially keeps your information in a way that is monetarily interesting for you. So, right, so you are being tracked, but this tracking mechanism directly results in an amount of money, and that money is then given in as a, so here we're being asked if Brave is a soft version of Tor. I don't think it is. So the basic attention token, if you look it up, it's number 75 on CoinMarketCap. So it's very high up out of thousands of coins. So this idea of being paid for the things that you watch is actually very prominent. But Carsten, could you elaborate that a little bit further? Is the Brave browser the Tor of our times? I don't think it is, because it's not as anonymous, right?
No, not yet. So the Brave browser is basically an internet browser with the key objective to protect your privacy and get rid of all the cookies and these things. But on the other hand, you have
They're selling your privacy, which is weird, no? For you,
it's protecting your privacy, but it also gives you the option to opt in. So it's basically also providing you wallet infrastructure, and then you can opt in. So when you're watching an app or an advertisement, an ad, then then this ad watching is being captured, it's being measured. It's what people call impressions. So all your impressions when watching an ad are being captured. And these impressions are then transferred into the so-called basic attention token. And I think this is an example where on the one hand side you're protecting your privacy, but on the other hand side you basically disclose how many ads you have been watched with all the impressions. But then you can but then you also get a monetary incentive, so which is a cryptocurrency token. So I like this example a lot because from a conceptual perspective, because it shows that you can make an informed decision to share some of your data, and then you get your monetary incentive back. I think, and it's a working use case where you basically share your data and you get money back. In this case, data are not. I think it's only kind of impressions on advertisement. You don't disclose your surfing behavior. You don't disclose your health data, nothing. You only disclose your advertisement consumption, and then you get some incentives back. I think it's an example where you kind of learn how to kind of protect your privacy on one hand side, but you also disclose something to get an incentive back. But this is also kind of a big risk, because when you think about, let's say, young people in socially difficult environments, so what data do they have? Yeah. And then they might be attempted kind of to share some not so favorable pictures of them to get some money for this. I think that's also a big risk. But I think at least we have to start kind of exploring the opportunities, kind of to protect our privacy, but also to do informed decision to share data, to get some incentives. But we should always be aware what the negative side is if we share too much data. Yeah?
So Diana also asked a question here about ways to deal with data differently than to monetize it. So the question is if it's not really dangerous actually to commercialize the data. And the thing is that, the creators of the World Wide Web, essentially they wanted it to be open, right? And they already then saw the boundaries of the capitalist system, and the World Wide Web was supposed to be something that is completely different from that. And then came people, before that, actually, we had people like Steve Jobs, who also believed in open source movements, who wanted to just work for a different philosophy. And so I love Steve Jobs and his story because what he did was that he went too naively into capitalism. And I feel like this is something that is going on with data at the moment too. What I mean by that is that Steve Jobs wanted to experiment. He wanted to work with the Walkman of Sony and then turn it into the iPod. He found the first mouse at HP and then wanted to turn it into this Apple mouse that everyone knows. And so he just wanted to play. And he was able to do that with Pixar and with companies that he later on joined or also co-created. But in the beginning of Apple, he made a very, very big mistake. He hired Scully from PepsiCo. And so Mark Scully from Pepsi wanted to produce 50 computers for the price of 100 and keep on selling them for 50 computers for the price of 100. And so then Steve Jobs was put into this position where he was saying, like, no, I really just want to create and build amazing things. And today it's almost like we have lost the connection to this movement, right? Later on in history, we had people like Aaron Schwartz who built Reddit, Reddit.com, and he actually he killed himself because some of his technology was taken away by the MIT, apparently. And so we have a lot of freedom fighters who were fighting for the open source movement, and they, in their own companies, partly were trying to keep everything open sourced or more accessible. And the companies themselves have opened up a way to commercialize things more and more. So the World Wide Web is also the worldwide commercialized web. And so I think that's why people were hoping for the blockchain movement to be so impactful. And actually it is so impactful. And Diana, I think that is why also countries such as China are blocking things like Bitcoin right now. And India also wanted to block Bitcoin, then took it back. So it's the question of power at the end of the day. And there is Tor, there are things like the shadow markets of our times. And I believe that it's going to remain interesting because also the topic of well-being is around self-ownership, right? Like if I have to live in a way every day that I don't like, and if I have to be someone I'm not, then, but I'm a good citizen and I make cash, or I'm legally fine. That doesn't mean that I'm happy. And also now with Corona, we have a lot of people following the rules, but like people are dying out there also out of boredom. And so, it's really the question of how we can use this data to also say to states like, hello, people are not doing well. And we don't all want to become slaves of big companies. Like now throughout Corona, for example, Alpha, which used to be Google, has gone up in its stock market price significantly. And so there is a very big risk of being divided between being a slave of the state and a slave of the actual tech giants. And the open source movement is not coming to the front so much, I think.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the kind of the well-being, yeah. Maybe we can quickly discuss about the kind of what happens in the digital age with all the agents, Paula? Because we mentioned Alexa, and we could also think about the future. So we have control about my data, and I let agents that I trust, which means software, machine learning that I trust, I kind of bring them to my data and let them work on my behalf and not share the data with anyone else. And that's a different concept. Maybe we should quickly discuss the Maslow pyramid and the agents. What do you think?
Yeah, and maybe I can move Diana to a speaker if she doesn't mind, and also Andreas.
Yeah, sure.
Is that? I don't know if they're okay with it. Okay, I just added them. Let's see what they do. But yeah, with digital agents, what that means is that you have a portal, an access point that collects your data, that essentially measures, your healthcare data, your purchasing data, what you listen to, any kind, and then you have a profile of yourself, and it can come in colors, it can come in sounds. And it's easier for you to navigate this. So these are the agents, and then you can work with them in a digital way, and you can also monetize your data. But the question here is, does it improve your well-being? Should we use more time curating our data online than to actually breathe and be good people? So maybe Andreas and Diana, could you introduce yourselves quickly? And thank you for being so active in the sessions. I'll go first with the lady, Diana.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'm afraid my camera doesn't seem to like this platform. I shouldn't be in this European summit because I'm in the UK. So I'm infiltrating. But I was invited because I work a lot with some European local currency people. And I guess I joined this session because I'm really interested in how we could use maybe blockchain tokens to, not only to protect our personal identity, but also to track flows that are enhancing our own human health and well-being, but also community social capital improvements in well-being on that kind of wider social scale. And I feel like just focusing on the data from things like existing health apps and purchasing apps, and Amazon and Google and Facebook and Instagram, these have been primarily hijacked by commercial organizations seeking to sell us things. Our data has become an advertising and a marketing tool. And okay, at the very least, we're not the beneficiaries. They might try and make it sound like we are, like, oh yes, you can get a cheaper deal on your whatever, or, as a thank you for sharing your data, or because we have more visibility of how risky you are. But it's not really about improving our well-being. It's really about improving their profitability. And my strong feeling is that somehow we need to unpick what we've allowed to develop. We belatedly came up with GDPR. It has not achieved what it was supposed to achieve because the organizations like Experian and Axiom and the various cookie companies like Pubmatics, they're not all in parts of the world that are covered by GDPR, because a lot of the data is processed in America, for example. But also, if I don't have their data, I can't go and find out what there is and correct it. So I don't have any rights really, and also I have no idea who's got my data because this is also hidden. As soon as I've accepted terms and conditions, and those conditions which I can't say no to without not buying the thing I need or not engaging in the service I need, those terms and conditions often say we can sell your data. And and then you have no idea where it's going. So, and they say, the Experians and Axioms of this world, they say we have legitimate, that GDPR has this idea of if you have a kind of legitimate commercial interest in using this data, then you're allowed to use it. And so they say, well, this is part of our business. It's what we do. We're allowed to use this data. But that's their interest. It's not my interest, and I haven't really given them permission to use that data. I gave it third party to someone else who then went and sold my data in ways that I couldn't foresee. And the whole ideas around this privacy and abuse of data. It's all completely broken, and I'm interested in how we can completely rethink all of this. Sorry to move on.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Andreas, maybe if you, with your introduction, if you have some thoughts.
Sure. I'll try to top that. I don't think I will. But, so I'm Andreas Waller. I work with innovation in Canada, and stumbled across this through the mayor of Mannheim. So in my area, we often talk about innovation and how we protect that innovation through IP, and how we look at IP from patents to copyright. And so I think there's a balance between protecting and sharing and in different venues. But in terms of data and the monetization of it, there are, as I think I mentioned, there are some app developers that are putting monetization or to kind of reward the user back with some money for their providing of data. So I think, and as we talked, as I said before, the Apple now is starting to say that, well, you can block Facebook from receiving your data if you're using our phone. So there's a little bit of disruption in the whole this free data sharing, and it's a maturing of the industry, if you will, as an industry becomes bigger and bigger. I mean, in the beginning, no one really cared what Facebook used as far as data. It was more of a small, little, fun social platform. But when it gets bigger and bigger and more integrated in society, cities and regions are communicating through this platform, then the voices for regulation and control becomes bigger as it becomes a utility. So it's a progression from being free to use and free to monetize to a more regulated industry like electricity.
I would say that the very large problem linked to what you said is also that we come out of this capitalist era where we have whole marketing departments thinking about how to target a user and what you might want for breakfast or for lunch or for dinner. And then suddenly we have these massive crises that are coming in, like Corona or like the ecological disasters of our time. And and just the downfall of nature. And so then people are demanding to have a say, and suddenly the lobby for that is becoming stronger. So it's interesting how the capitalist system is moving more towards the personal ownership of data. And now we have different tools that are also being developed by students. I work with a company that's called Teach. It's TECH.de. And so these are the 500 schools that we're working together with, and they're bringing classrooms online. And their massive problem right now is actually that there is so much bullying online as well. So if you democratize these tools and you take them away from the capitalist system that is only focused on one consumer with probably a lot of money or with this and that profile, then suddenly you have this open source movement where it really gives people a voice, and people have not been heard for a very, very long time. And so the thing is that well-being is also a topic if you're not well, you know, and what do we do in a world where people are not well? Because right now people are shouting, they're being extremely rude to each other. There's a lot of online crime. And that is also the downside of measuring well-being. And the thing is that if we don't look at that, we don't accurately measure data. And the problem is if states that have run into massive problems right now because of their lack of support with Corona and, you know, in Germany, it was a very big topic, how the vaccinations were being given out and how financial aid was being given out. And so states just face a lot of criticism right now. And then there's the online bullying. So it's easier to ignore that or to look away rather than to actually try and deal with that. And it's just difficult to deal with a topic when it's already there. And now the companies won't help. And now, now we're left in this state of what do we actually do? We need to promote well-being online and offline, but who's going to pay for it and what's going to happen? And I believe that that's interesting right now for the open source movement to come back, because now is actually a chance to use all of these things like the Brave browser to actually test new things like Teach, the platform, that are not so commercially driven. But we'll see about that. So it's really a gap that we're facing right now, I believe. In terms
I think the online bullying is quite a new phenomenon. It's very difficult to control, and it's very easy to run away after you've done damage, and to run away and be anonymous again. Just the same as in my neighbor country, their First Amendment free speech was written when free speech was standing up on a soapbox or a box in the town square, and you have a certain audience. Now you can stand up online and have a huge audience and have huge ramifications or effect, positive and negative, and that plays tricks on people, I think.
Hey, Diana, you also touched a bit on the question. Okay, what are the instruments to make sure the balance of power swings back from the big corporates to the individuals? Are you aware of the self-sovereign identity movement?
The what? Sorry?
So it's called self-sovereign identity movement. Are you aware of this?
No.
Maybe I should.
I think Diana is trying to come back in. I think she was.
I was just going to say that I'm not aware of that, but I'm aware and I'm in touch with and I'm part of various people who are trying to push GDPR to its absolute maximum to try and redress that balance a bit. And I would, for example, there's the Privacy Collective Foundation. They're a Dutch-based company that is looking at, they've already started an action against Salesforce, and I think one is now underway with Experian as well.
How are you dealing with GDPR in the UK right now?
Well, we still have, our since January the 1st, we're still aligned with the GDPR. We passed our own law, so we still have that. So, for example, we're looking at doing cases using GDPR law in the US against US companies using class actions, because the class action law is better in the States, and those stateside companies should still, where they're operating in the UK, be abiding by GDPR, which they're not. Certainly, we would really question whether or not they have any legitimate interest in collecting and using this data to profile people. So, I think that work is going on, but it frankly, it's David and Goliath. It's a very uphill struggle. And, this is why I'm saying GDPR is largely toothless, because it's not really able to get at the heart of how Google and Facebook and the other, huge giants that have taken over as the top 10 the top 10 companies in the world, and they are all making their money from an abuse of personal data.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's exactly what's being addressed in the self-sovereign identity movement, because you are on Facebook, because you would like to connect to the other Facebook users, yeah, and then to exchange messages and build some communities and share some news. And the basic idea of decentralized identity or self-sovereign identity is that you can achieve exactly the same, but without the Facebook, yeah. And this goes back to very old cartoon at the beginnings of the internet that they said, so there's a missing digital identity layer. If you're on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, yeah. So if you're not on a dog platform, yeah, then of course all the dogs are on the dog platform, then you know, there's another dog on the platform. But if I just meet another entity in the digital space, I don't know, is it a human, a dog, is it a Siemens employee, is it an employee of the UK government? I just don't know this, yeah. And this missing identity is basically the core why these big platforms have been established, because they had the aggregation power. So they aggregated tooling, identity, and transactions, and people just kind of jumped on these platforms, and now they're doing their social media transactions on them. But when this missing identity layer is being fixed, and that's basically what the self-sovereign identity is about. It's basically also the inventors of the internet. So it's Tim Berners-Lee who's working on the problem, because today we have encrypted data on the internet, but we don't have signed data in the internet. And that's a big problem, because when Alice and Bob, who have never met before, and they meet in the internet, and Alice has a couple of credentials like driver license credential, birth certificate, identity card, and then Alice can decide what data does she want to disclose. Does she want to disclose her age, her place of living, or if she is older or younger than 18 years. So Alice can decide, and basically can do this what's kind of required for the use case, and disclose this data to Bob, but without being the same people on the same platforms. And that's what being addressed with the decentralized identity. It's basically transforming the internet where data encrypted to an internet where data encrypted and signed and controlled by the individuals. And by the way, the Christopher Allen, who invented the S in HTTPS, and Tim Berners-Lee, they are also working on this technology. And there's big open source standardization bodies. It's a Decentralized Identity Foundation, it's a Linux Foundation, it's W3C. They are now pushing very hard on putting these standards in place for self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, to empower individuals to take back control about their data, but still, so if Alice, Bob, and Charlie meet, so that they can establish trust among each other. And by the way, there are also a couple of other non-profit bodies like the legal entity, Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, GS1, Department of Homeland Security. They're all jumping on the same bandwagon. And I would say there's a continuum when you apply this technology. And this is this very interesting continuum. On the one hand side, you can use this technology to establish extreme privacy preserving solutions. On the other hand, you can use the same technology to have full verifiable back to birth life cycle transparency. For a human, you don't want to have this, because then the human would be a transparent human. You would know everything. The human is more on the privacy tooling side. But for circular economy, you would exactly have this. If I find an item in a supply chain, I would like to go back in this life cycle to find out, was it produced with renewable energy, with biosourced plastics? So was it kind of, let's say, child labor involved or no child labor involved? That's exactly what you would like to know about an object. And that's so fascinating about technology, because it's open source. There are thousands and thousands of man years invested, and you can use it for providing very sophisticated privacy preserving tools, but also for applying it for full transparency in circular supply chains. And what I wanted to mention, so in Germany right now, the Chancellor Angela Merkel, so she's pushing a project with 18 big companies to get this decentralized identity into the daily life of citizens. Yeah. So when they onboard with a bank, when they onboard with an e-commerce company, when they onboard with a mobility platform provider, yeah. So then they have control about their identity. They only disclose what they need to disclose. What's interesting, there's technology in place that you can work with pairwise pseudonymous identifiers, which means, so when I onboard for e-commerce, I have the name Alice, But when I onboard for, let's say, for banking transaction, I have the name Bob. I can use different identifiers, which basically avoids correlation of my transactions among multiple platforms. Yeah, and so in Germany is a very big movement to adopt this, because Germany fell pretty much behind in the entire digitalization, and now they would like to adopt the technology kind of fast, and then to leapfrog some of the big platforms. Let's see if it works. But then there are also a lot of government-funded projects. One is ID Union, and right now there's 60 big companies from Deutsche Bahn to Siemens, Bosch. They're also working on this technology. Sometimes for the human privacy, sometimes for full transparency for circular economy. There are a couple of use cases from e-government to education, financial, IoT, to e-health. And that's very interesting, because you can apply this technology for identity of a human, for identity of a vehicle, of a product, enterprise, or service. And then when Alice and Bob can be human, a machine, and an enterprise they've never met before, but then they can exchange credentials in a standardized way. And then with the credentials, they establish trust. And then in addition, so then can establish then content agreements, business transactions, fully verifiable. And they can even provide provenance and supply chain. And that's a big promise of this technology. This might be able to change the rules in the internet, but of course it's still kind of, let's say, a question mark if it can achieve it. But there are very big movements, and especially in the EU, it's not only Germany. There's a lot of big projects on the EU level that are really pushing hard on putting this technology into operations.
And of course, Achilles showed us that the heel, or like the smallest part of a person or a society, could be the most important part. Achilles had his heel, was wounded, and that's how essentially he was slayed down. And that links to the question of old people in society, or people of older age, let's say. I don't want to sound like I'm discriminating anybody. But what you just described, Carsten, is something that is very new to a lot of people. And so well-being in a society also means to explain new developments well to people who might not understand what is going on. And so I think that will remain a very big task in the future. Also, since families are declining, I believe, and it's important for young people to also keep on reaching out to the older generations. Some young people these days are annoyed by what people before them did, and maybe they don't want to engage so much in societies, but it is very important, right, to work together and to educate one another about the possibilities, as hard as it may be.
Yeah.
So thank you all for this wonderful discussion. And I think that the concept of well-being in the online world is still something that we massively need to look into. And I look forward to engaging with all of you in the future to find out how exactly we can continue to measure and ensure well-being. We have a flower that's coming from a supportive company that's called Teams. So it's like Teams from Microsoft. And I shared the link here with you. It's actually not the last link. It's my second last link from 7 minutes ago. And so everyone who would like to give a statement that will be published online as to how you perceive well-being and how you think it should be measured online with data, and what then should be what should happen with that data. Just a little bit of a personal statement as to what you heard today. Please do that. You will find the link on the message that I just shared. And I thank everyone for being here. And I wish you a wonderful day from Munich. Let's keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Cheers.